I wasn't exactly in the mood to celebrate New Year's Eve this year. It's not like I'm ever the life of the party, but after the year I'd had, staying home felt right. A quiet night with some leftovers and a drink sounded better than fake smiles and pretending I had things to toast to. I told myself it was fine. I didn't need a big celebration. So, I watched the countdown on TV alone, clinked a glass of cheap champagne to nobody, and dragged myself to bed shortly after the fireworks ended. The house was silent, as expected. Just me and the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional groan of old wood settling in the walls. It was comforting in its way, this solitude. I tucked myself under the blankets, scrolling mindlessly on my phone until my eyes grew heavy. I remember thinking, this is fine. It's just another night. But I wasn't asleep long before a sound jolted me awake. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. A clatter, like something falling onto the kitchen floor. My first thought was the cat, but then I remembered, I don't have a cat. My pulse quickened as I strained to listen, holding my breath. A long silence followed, and I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe something had just shifted on the counter. But then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate shuffle, the kind that doesn't happen by accident. Adrenaline kicked in, and I sat up, heart pounding. My mind raced through the possibilities. Could someone have broken in? It seemed unlikely. My neighborhood's pretty quiet, and I always double-checked the locks before bed. Still, the sound was there. Real. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, grabbing the wooden bat I kept leaning against the wall. It had been collecting dust since high school, but tonight, it felt like the only shield I had. With one hand clutching the bat and the other gripping my phone, ready to call 911, I crept toward the kitchen. The hallway felt longer than usual, the darkness stretching out in front of me. Each step was cautious, the floor creaking beneath my weight. I reached the doorway and paused, holding my breath again. The kitchen light was off, but faint moonlight from the window illuminated the room enough for me to see that. Everything looked normal. The chairs were in place. The counters were clear. The sink empty. I flicked on the light, expecting, chaos? A mess? Someone crouched in the shadows? But it was just my kitchen, as ordinary as ever. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I took a cautious step forward, scanning every corner, every shadow. That's when I saw it. A note, a single piece of paper lying flat on the table. I swear it hadn't been there earlier. I approached it slowly, the bat still gripped tightly in my hand. The paper was old and yellowed, like it had been ripped from an ancient notebook. Written on it, in handwriting I'd recognize anywhere, was a phrase I hadn't heard in months. This year you will succeed, son. I believe in you. My dad used to say that to me every New Year. It was his thing, his way of reminding me to keep going, to not give up on myself. But my dad had died 7 months ago. He was gone. And yet, here it was, his exact words in his handwriting, staring back at me from the table. I stumbled back, my mind racing to find some logical explanation. Maybe I'd left it here somehow. Forgotten it? Maybe someone was playing a cruel prank? But none of it made sense. I checked the locks again, the front door, the back door, the windows. Everything was secure. No sign of a break-in. I returned to the kitchen, bat still in hand, half expecting someone to jump out from behind a corner. But it was empty, just me and the note. I sat down, staring at it, my thoughts a tangled mess of fear and grief. For a moment, I even considered calling out to him, as ridiculous as it sounded. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I whispered, "Dad." Nothing, just silence. I don't know how long I sat there, the bat lying forgotten on the floor, my phone still clutched in my hand. Eventually, I picked up the note, running my fingers over the words. The ink smudged slightly, fresh enough to smear. I haven't told anyone about that night. Not my friends, not my coworkers. It's too personal, too strange to explain. I keep the note tucked away in a drawer now, but every so often, I take it out and read it, wondering if maybe, just maybe, my dad found a way to reach out. To remind me that I'm not as alone as I think. Or maybe it's something else entirely. Started like any other New Year's Eve. The air was bitterly cold, and a thin layer of snow covered the ground like a glittering blanket. I had spent the evening at a party with friends, laughing, drinking, and watching the clock count down to midnight. The kind of night you'd expect, filled with warmth and noise despite the icy grip of winter outside. By the time I decided to leave, it was well past 2 a.m. The streets were quiet, the kind of eerie stillness you only get after a heavy snowfall. My phone had been my lifeline throughout the night, coordinating rides, taking pictures, and sharing resolutions. But as I stood on the sidewalk outside my friend's house, I glanced at the screen and saw the dreaded message. Battery low. A moment later, it flickered off entirely. Dead. I cursed under my breath. No GPS, no calling a cab, no safety net. The walk home was about 2 miles, manageable even in the cold. Besides, the streets were empty. What could possibly go wrong? I wrapped my coat tighter around me and started walking, my boots crunching against the snow. The occasional streetlight illuminated my path, but most of the way was steeped in shadow. It was quiet, too quiet. No wind, no distant fireworks, no cars. Just me, my footsteps, and the occasional gust of my breath in the frozen air. About halfway home, I heard it. At first, it was faint, just the hum of an engine in the distance. But as it grew louder, my chest tightened. Car was coming up behind me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw headlights piercing through the darkness. Relief washed over me at first. Maybe it was someone I knew, but the car didn't pass. Instead, it slowed to a crawl, keeping pace with me. My instincts kicked in immediately. I quickened my steps, hoping they'd take the hint and drive on. But they didn't. The car continued to roll forward, its tires crunching softly against the snow, always staying just behind me. I could feel their gaze burning into my back. My heart was pounding now, each beat echoing in my ears like a drum. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were just looking for someone, or maybe they'd pull over and ask for directions. But deep down, I knew better. I crossed the street abruptly, hoping to throw them off, but the car followed. That's when the fear really set in. I broke into a jog, my breath coming out in short, panicked bursts. The car accelerated to match my pace. When I reached a corner, I bolted, full sprint. I heard the engine roar as the driver gunned it to catch up. My lungs burned as I ran, slipping and stumbling on the icy pavement. I darted down an alley, praying it was too narrow for the car to follow. The engine cut off abruptly, replaced by the unmistakable sound of a car door slamming. They were on foot now. I didn't stop to look back. I just kept running, my boots slipping on the slick ground, my heart hammering in my chest. I turned down another alley, then another, trying to lose them in the labyrinth of backstreets. Eventually, I found a small alcove, a recessed doorway to what looked like an abandoned building. I ducked inside, pressing myself flat against the door, and held my breath. My pulse was so loud in my ears I was certain they could hear it. Then I heard them. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, crunching against the snow as they moved closer. "Where are you?" a voice called out. It was low, gravelly, almost a whisper, but it carried through the night like a scream. I clenched my teeth, willing myself to stay silent. My body was trembling, not from the cold but from sheer, paralyzing terror. The footsteps stopped. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but silence. Then, closer this time, the voice, "I saw you run this way." Tears pricked at my eyes, but I didn't dare make a sound. I pressed myself tighter against the door, as if I could disappear into it. Minutes passed. Agonizingly slow minutes that felt like hours. I heard the footsteps retreat, then return, as if they were circling, searching. Eventually, the footsteps faded completely, replaced by the distant rumble of the car engine as it drove away. But I didn't move. I stayed in that doorway, frozen, for what must have been 2 hours, too terrified to even breathe deeply. When I finally emerged, the streets were silent again. The snow was undisturbed except for the faint tire tracks leading away. I ran all the way home, my legs shaky, my lungs burning. I locked every door and window the moment I got inside, then collapsed onto the floor, my entire body trembling. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. To this day, I don't know who was in that car or what they wanted. But I do know one thing. I'll never walk home alone at night again. It happened 2 years ago on New Year's Eve. I was working the late shift at a small convenience store just outside of town. It wasn't the kind of place people flock to for their holiday shopping. More like a last-minute stop for batteries, snacks, or forgotten party supplies. The store was quiet that night, except for the occasional rush of icy wind when the automatic doors opened. Most people were home celebrating, but I was stuck under the harsh fluorescent lights, counting down the hours until midnight. Around 10:30 p.m., a man walked in. He wasn't one of the usual customers. Tall, wiry, and dressed in a threadbare coat. He moved with a stiffness that made my skin crawl. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and dark, and he kept his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He didn't browse the shelves like most customers. Instead, he stood near the entrance, staring at the rows of aisles like he was searching for something or someone. "Can I help you find anything?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned his head slowly, too slowly, and his lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "No, just looking," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Then he went back to scanning the aisles, his gaze lingering on the far corner of the store where the storage room door stood slightly ajar. Something about him set me on edge. I dealt with my fair share of strange customers, but this guy was different. He didn't have the jittery energy of someone trying to shoplift or the glazed look of someone just passing time. He felt calculated, like he had a plan and I was part of it. The man wandered deeper into the store, disappearing behind the shelves. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and went back to organizing the counter. A few minutes later, I heard the faint sound of humming, an eerie, tuneless melody. It was coming from the back of the store. I stepped out from behind the counter, my heart pounding. "Sir, is everything all right?" I called out. The humming stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. Then I heard it, a faint tapping sound, like fingernails drumming on metal. It was coming from the storage room. I grabbed the flashlight we kept under the counter and crept toward the sound, every step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the door, I hesitated. It was open wider now, and the darkness inside seemed to spill out into the dimly lit aisle. "Sir," I called again, my voice shaking. No response. I pushed the door open with the flashlight, its beam cutting through the shadows. The room was empty, or so I thought. The tapping sound echoed again, louder this time, coming from the far corner. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I saw him, crouched in the corner, his face twisted into a grin that sent shivers down my spine. He wasn't humming anymore. He was whispering, but I couldn't make out the words. "Hey, you can't be back here," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The man didn't move. He just kept whispering, his eyes locked on mine. Then, without warning, he bolted past me. So close I could feel the cold air he carried with him. He was fast, too fast, and by the time I turned around, he was gone. The front doors whooshed open, and a gust of icy wind swept through the store. I ran to the entrance, but there was no sign of him. No footprints in the snow, no shadow disappearing into the night. It was like he'd vanished. Shaken, I locked the doors and called my manager. "Someone broke into the storage room," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. My manager promised to send someone over, but I could tell he thought I was overreacting. I spent the next hour trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every creak, every flicker of the lights made my stomach churn. Midnight came and went, and I was relieved when my coworker finally showed up to relieve me. I told him what happened, but he just shrugged it off. When I got home, I couldn't sleep. The man's face, that grin, and those whispers haunted me. The next morning, I decided to check the store's security cameras. I needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. What I saw still chills me to this day. The footage showed the man entering the store and wandering the aisles, just as I remembered. But when he disappeared behind the shelves, he never reappeared. There was no footage of him leaving, not through the front door, the back exit, or anywhere else. It was as if he'd stepped out of frame and into another world. I quit the job a week later. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. Even now, every New Year's Eve, I find myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that twisted grin in the shadows.